This is the Global Travel Channel podcast show, and I am your host, Mark Philpott. Welcome to the show, and if you are a regular listener, it's always good to have you back. And knowing that you're there listening to our episodes, if you're a first timer, welcome aboard. It's great to have you here. Let me know how you found out about the show. On the show, I interview people all across the world about their different travel experiences. We get into all sorts of things, from adventure travel to understanding what it's like to travel the world as a solo backpacker. Or maybe, like on today's show, we're going to talk about what is it like to travel the world as a vegan. Can you actually get vegan travel tours? Well, the answer is yes. And my guest today is going to tell us all about world vegan travel. So why don't we head on over and introduce you to my guest today. Her name is Brighde Reed. Brighde, welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show.
I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Excited to have you on the show for a whole host of reasons today, because you are a true world traveller. You've been in the travel business for a long time, and I'm sure you've got some wonderful pieces of advice and wonderful stories to share with my audience today. So I really are excited about having you on the show. Whereabouts in the world are you talking to us from today?
I am talking to you from Bangkok, Thailand.
Oh, Bangkok, Thailand. But with that accent, you're not from Bangkok, Thailand originally, of course.
No, I'm not. I grew up in the UK, and when I was 18 years old, my family emigrated to Australia. And whilst I had a really nice time in Australia, I got the travel bug right then and there. So I've lived in many different places since then.
Whereabouts in Australia did you live?
Well, I moved over for my tertiary education. And it's a bit of a long story, but basically I ended up in a country town in New South Wales called Armidale, which is quite a small town, but that's where I did my tertiary education. I spent some time in Sydney as well, but basically I left Australia after graduation. Up
in the New England area.
That's right.
Yeah, beautiful. It's a beautiful part of the world up around there.
It is. It's really very pretty.
And I've got to say, actually, it's a part of Australia where not a lot of tourists get to, because it's off the beaten track a little bit as far as tourism goes.
Yeah, definitely international travellers don't go there so much, which is a shame, because it has really incredible national parks and hiking and unique countryside, amazing waterfalls, UNESCO World Heritage National Parks. It really has a lot of great things for visitors.
So there you go, everyone. Put Armidale on your tourist itinerary for going to Australia next time you're out there. It sounds like it's a wonderful area to explore, especially if you like a bit of hiking and etc. Now, Brighde, on my show, what I do for every one of my guests is I give you the opportunity to actually dedicate your episode to someone special in your life. So who would you like to dedicate this episode to?
Oh, my goodness. Right. Well, I guess I would have to dedicate it to my partner, Seb. He is we've been together for 15 years, and he is my partner in all things travel, and he is a bit of a whiz at developing itineraries and doing a lot of the hard work when it comes to planning travels. I have my other skills that I bring to our adventures, but he does so much of the hard work, and I'm so grateful to that.
Well, that's beautiful. So, Seb, this is dedicated to you. You and Brighde are going to be able to sit down together and listen to this over maybe dinner one night this week and share in the glory of the Global Travel Channel podcast show.
Thank you. That's so kind.
You're welcome. Now, we're going to talk a lot about world vegan travel today, but before we get there, I thought it might be an opportunity to get to know you a little bit better in terms of your travel experience. So, has travel always been a big part of your life?
Yes, yeah, it really has, which is strange because I didn't do so much travel as a child. I grew up in the south of England, but my mum, she was a little bit unique in that she had me sort of a little bit later on compared with most people at that time, and she had done a lot of traveling in the 1960s, including with a friend of hers, with a car, traveled all through Eastern Europe and Russia. So obviously during that time, that was really quite a unique and interesting thing to do. And she liked to tell stories about her travels, and I was just absolutely enthralled by them. And you know, even though we didn't do a lot of traveling when I was a child, my mum and dad did a really great job at taking me out into the local woodlands and just doing really nice things in the countryside around where I live. So I guess I was exposed to those things, which was really nice. And also my parents really encouraged me to know a lot about what was going on in the world. So I guess my curiosity was piqued in that way.
That's a terrific story. Whereabouts in the southeast of England were you from?
I grew up in a little village called Angring. I'm sure no one has heard of it, but most people have heard of Brighton, which is a large town not far away.
There's a lot of listeners to my show that follow the Brighton Football Club, so I'm sure that a lot of people know exactly where you're from. It's a beautiful part of England down there, isn't it?
It really is. The South Downs are beautiful. Yeah, I agree.
What do you miss the most about that part of the world?
I think I have a lot of affection for the South Downs and the countryside. Of course, I've still got family there, but I think the South Downs is really, really very pretty indeed. So yeah, that's where my memories, where I have a lot of memories.
So for someone listening today and who wanted to travel to that part of the world for the first time, what would you recommend them to do exactly?
Okay. Well, I would... something that I have done, which I really loved, and maybe this would be interesting. I was lucky enough to do only half, sadly time didn't allow, but half of the South Downs Way, which is I think a 11 or 12 day hike going through the South Downs, which is, it's not challenging, it's hilly, but certainly not mountainous, and it's really great for beginner hikers because it's not in the wilderness at all. Like each night you can stay at little villages in pubs or bed and breakfasts, so it's a really great taster into overnight hiking, but you don't have to carry lots of gear, and you'll just walk through beautiful countryside, through really cute villages. I would recommend that for people if they have the opportunity.
Okay, there you go. There's 2 recommendations already from Brighde today to get off to Armidale in Australia and to the South Downs in the southeast of the UK, which is a beautiful part of the world. Thank you for sharing those. You must have been really inspired by your mother's stories. Did you want to get in a car yourself and head off to Eastern Europe and do all those things that she did?
Yes, of course. I definitely put all of those on the list, and they are still on the list, if I'm honest with you. But really, anywhere and everywhere was an exciting destination for me as a child. I just wanted to go to lots of places.
So what was your first international travel experience that you can really remember with a lot of detail?
Yes, yeah. Well, I was lucky enough to do a French exchange when I was in high school, and we did that through my school, and it was just popping over to the Channel to France, but it was just so interesting. And I was lucky enough, I stayed with the same family both times, and the second time that I went, we actually I'd actually become vegetarian at that point, so it was my first sort of time traveling as a vegetarian, and of course, you know, it was fine, but it was a bit of a challenge for me because, of course, you know, there was a big change from when my family had looked after me for the first year and I wasn't vegetarian, and then, of course, the next year I was. So, you know, that took a little bit of negotiation, and as a 13-year-old, that was a bit of a challenge, but, it was okay.
Did you have a real appetite for further travel after you had those experiences in France? Did you want to go and take on the world, so to speak?
Absolutely, yes, without a doubt.
So what happened then in terms of, was there planning around getting to see more of the world? How did your next travel experiences evolve from that period?
Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, the big one, I guess, was emigrating to another country, to Australia with my family. And I went to Armidale and I went to university, but it was always like a stopgap. I just wanted to finish university and to start traveling. And even though I really enjoyed my time in Australia and I had such wonderful opportunities there, I was quite homesick. So my first thing was after university and graduation was I wanted to go back to the UK for a little while and just catch up with family and friends there. But also I had actually qualified as a French teacher through my education, but I knew that I needed to spend a good amount of time in France. So I applied for, and this is something that a program that still is available for people. I applied for an English assistantship role. You didn't have to be a teacher to do this. I just happened to be one. And I worked in a French school for 8 months as an English conversation teacher, which was a paid position. They didn't pay you a lot, but certainly enough to live and to have really great holidays. And that was a really wonderful experience.
So is that what you studied at university, was it?
It was one of the subjects I studied at university, yeah. And so I did my graduate diploma in education. I was able to teach French, but I could not really function well in French, so I decided to go to France and have this experience. And of course it was just such a wonderful one, and because I was only working 3 days a week, I got to have these incredible long weekends where I could explore a huge amount of France during that time.
Did you fall in love with France?
Yes. Definitely.
It's an amazing country, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah, it has everything. It has so many different landscapes. The country is great. The people are wonderful. Yeah, I really love it. And of course, being able to speak the language helps a lot.
Now, the English have a very, let's say, obvious relationship with the French. There seems to be, well, it goes back centuries, of course, but it's interesting seeing British people when they actually go to France, because they do change a bit, don't they? And the whole attitude towards the French changes quite a bit.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a rivalry between the French and the English, but I think it's really stereotyping, to be honest. I found the French to be always so kind and friendly and helpful to me. There are some cultural differences which, once you know about, you understand them. You know, this idea that the French people aren't friendly, and that's really not true. They're just not super smiley. And the rationale behind that is that they, why would you be super smiley and ask questions, say, how are you, to people where you don't really know them? Like, that's really alien to them. So we interpret that as them being unfriendly, but actually they are very, very kind and welcoming, in my opinion.
What I love about them too is they're fiercely patriotic, and I remember I lived in Europe for nearly 13 years and spent a lot of my time in France as well, and there were many occasions when you were talking to somebody who you knew would be able to speak English to you, or who knew could speak English, but they just didn't want to speak English because they wanted you to immerse yourself in the French experience. And I used to love that, because it became a bit of a challenge in a game sometimes, with that whole patrioticism towards French culture, which is outstanding. It must have been great for you to be able to immerse yourself in the language after studying it and being living there. That must have been really fantastic.
Oh, it was wonderful. And of course my French just skyrocketed in terms of my proficiency. And I know you don't have to live in a country, especially in this day and age, to master a language, but certainly becoming an assistant in a French school is a really great opportunity for people to learn French and become immersed and to work in a French environment.
Did you have a French boyfriend at the time?
No, I did not.
They say that getting someone of the same nationality helps as far as pillow talk goes as well, yeah?
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah, my current partner, Seb, he's French-Canadian, but we didn't meet until a few years after my living in France experience. And we actually met in Morocco, which is another widely French-spoken country.
What do the French nationals in France think of French Canadian people? What's the relationship they're like?
That's really interesting. Seb tells me that that they are really very affectionate towards French Canadians, and they love the accent. And Seb always laughs in that whenever he goes to France, or Morocco for that matter, he always cleans up his French, because French Canadian, or maybe it's just the way that Seb speaks, is quite sort of slangy, and their sort of curse words are very different. But they kind of think that French Canadians are quite cute.
I was going to ask if the French Canadian accent is like any other particular department in France. Is there a similarity to a particular area of France?
Not to my knowledge. All I know is that I find it quite challenging when I'm sitting down with my French Canadian in-laws and they're all sort of talking and joking. It's certainly harder to follow than French in France. However, with practice, I'm sure I will understand more.
Now, back to you becoming a vegetarian. How did that come onto your radar? What made you turn into a vegetarian?
Yeah, well, I was vegetarian for many, many years before I became vegan. And I think it initially happened when I was just 7 years old. And we were going for a walk in our local woodland. And if you have any British people listening, you'll know that most of the land in the UK is privately owned. And as such, people hunt on this land and those kinds of things. Well, there's still public access to a lot of it. So I went to visit a local landowner's farm, and we went to go and feed the ducks at this little pond lake there. And then as I was walking back with my family, shots rang out and they were shooting the ducks that I had just been feeding. Now, as you can imagine, for a 7-year-old, because I think children are naturally very, very, they haven't been desensitized yet to a lot of this stuff. Their heart just breaks for this, and I just couldn't understand it. And I think that, combined with a few other factors, made me want to become vegetarian. And that sort of carried with me for many, many years until I became vegan 11 years ago now.
So you were a very conscious 7-year-old.
Yeah, I guess I've always felt very passionately about social justice issues, and I was not necessarily very effective, but I was always wanting to speak out in terms of injustice. Like I had seems like ancient history now, but I was very vocally against nuclear power and nuclear weapons, which was of course a really big issue at the time. I just felt very strong in terms of injustice and fairness.
What I'm interested to know is when you change your, I guess, consciousness about the way you live, and diet and nutrition is one aspect of doing that, did you immediately become somebody who took a very strong stance on it and tried to talk your friends and family members into becoming vegetarian as well?
Yeah, that's a really great question. As a child, I think I was quite outspoken, but, I'm sure I wasn't doing it very effectively. And I do remember a little conversation that I had with my dad as a vegetarian. And, I'm sure I was pretty indignant about eating meat and those kinds of things. And my dad, he actually pointed out the fact that I had leather shoes on and the fact that I was drinking dairy, and I didn't know much about these industries at the time. There was no internet then. He sort of pointed out that I was maybe being a little bit inconsistent here, and I did kind of stop speaking out. But later on, many years later, when I found out more about it, then we haven't talked about it yet, and we don't have to, but I am very, very passionate about these issues, and I'm doing much more to speak out and to educate others about these kinds of issues. But whilst navigating relationships and all of these other, and tradition and culture and all of these things at the same time.
No, I do want to talk a lot about it, because today one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was to, I guess, debunk a lot of the myths that are out there about being a vegan. And because you also run a travel organisation that's focused particularly on that, I'm interested to know the psychology and the philosophies behind people that are really strong about this movement, because it is becoming something that's much more consciously aware within the world we live in today. And I think it's a duty of people like us who have podcast shows and blog sites and travel companies to actually educate people and to put as much information out there as we can so that people can make their own decisions based on... Let's talk about your transition from vegetarian to becoming a vegan. How did that actually happen?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So like I said, I was vegetarian for 20 years and had travelled a lot as a vegetarian, including being a tour leader for a travel company. I'm sure many of our travellers, many of the listeners here will have heard of Intrepid Travel. I worked for them for 4.5 years or something. And it was actually started by my partner, Seb. This was way back in 2009, and he gifted me a smartphone. So obviously this was, just at the stage of when smartphones became available. And for some reason, I stumbled across podcasts really quickly. So I've been listening to podcasts for a really long time. And I stumbled across this podcast, which at the time was called Vegetarian Food for Thought. And it was by Colleen Patrick Goodrow. And there weren't a lot of podcasts at that time. And of course, I was vegetarian, so I listened to it. And to say that the information in this podcast was life-changing is, it really was life-changing for me. So I'd been vegetarian for a long time, thinking that I was helping animals, and certainly I was. I really felt like, eating animals was wrong in quotation marks, and that, it didn't need to do it, and I'd been living a really great life without doing these things. And then I found the truth about the dairy and egg industry, and for people that don't know that, for listeners that don't know about this, was, I kind of was under the impression that, animals didn't have to die for them to give us, in quotation marks, the eggs and milk. And when I heard about this information, I won't go into it here. Listeners can look up some information about this, like Dairy is Scary is a really great video on YouTube. When I found out this information, I really thought that this does not align with my values of compassion and non-violence. These don't align with those at all. And, I was lucky enough that in this podcast, because there wasn't so much information available back then, not only did I figure out the reasons why being vegan was a really great thing to do, but also how to do it as well, because she gave a lot of tips and techniques, and she delivered it in such a way that was really helpful for me. So I became vegan pretty quickly, and I started cooking delicious food, and Seb really enjoyed the food as well. And then he just quietly became vegan as well about 6 months later, and he said to me, "Did you realize I've been vegan for 6 weeks?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness, you have." So of course I was lucky that Seb came and joined for the ride. So that is wonderful. But yeah, veganism is really about trying to live a life where you cause the least harm. And the reality is, most of us are very, very disconnected from what is on our plates and what it took to get there. And it's kept hidden for a reason. There are more and more investigations out there which are showing us the truth about what happens in animal agriculture. But most of us are very disconnected between that and, because we know, or the industry knows, I should say, that if we knew, we wouldn't want to participate in it. And of course, it involves changing our habits and our lifestyles and the dishes that we create. And because, of course, food is such a huge part of our tradition, our background, our heritage. And so it can be a challenge, but it is a really worthwhile thing. I would say that going vegan was the best thing I did in my life.
So going back to that podcast you listened to when you did that transition, were you at a stage in your own personal evolution where you were looking for something next after the vegetarianism, or what was your position? Was this podcast just a catalyst that came out of nowhere, or?
It really did. And honestly, I had been vegetarian for a long time, and I was living in northern Vietnam at that point. And I really felt sick of being vegetarian, to be honest. The inconveniences. At that time, I felt, of course, now I feel very differently. I felt that there were, it was inconvenient, and that I was missing out on all of these great cultural experience. I guess maybe I was a little bit lost, but I certainly wasn't looking at something to get me on board and back on board, or even further in that. Like, I really was considering, maybe seafood would be okay, and all of these sorts of things. But that was something that I was really mulling around in my head. And, honestly, I just happened to listen to this podcast because there weren't a lot of podcasts at that time. And this one seemed to be, vaguely connected with me. So that's why I started listening. But yeah, I didn't mention, for me, a real catalyst moment of listening to that podcast was, and this is something I think a lot of vegans think about, is I was listening to the podcast whilst I was sort of falling asleep, which I often do with podcasts even today. And I was listening to what goes into the feather industry, and what happens to the ducks and the goose for them to end up in our sleeping bags, and in this case on the pillow that my head was on. And this was really very, very upsetting. And I'm like, wow, I had no idea that so much suffering went into my feather pillow or my feather sleeping bag, or Canada Goose jacket, or whatever it is. So yeah, it was quite an awakening.
I'm really pleased to hear you talking about these things, because I'm a big advocate these days of more conscious living, and for somebody that lives on a sailboat and who's really connected to nature, and also using as less renewable energy as possible, because I'm using the wind and the sun to basically generate all the power I need for my life.
Yeah,
I think it's fascinating once you actually start educating yourself. And just listening to you now, one of the themes that I've had on my show of recent times is I've been talking to different guests about going off and volunteering around the world at different charity organisations. A lot of people travel to do good in the world, and they think they're having a great impact on making the world a better place. But as we all know, just like what you're talking about in terms of the conscious living through what goes on into our mouths and the products that we use every day, the same could be said about the charity industry around the world, and what's really truly happening at these orphanages that people go and volunteer their time at, and all the rest of it. So I'm really pleased to see and to talk to people like you who are living a more conscious life, but also who are educating themselves through that process. And I think that's the key to this whole process. I'm interested to know when you got to a level where you wanted to combine, you and Seb wanted to combine the vegan lifestyle into a travel company. How did that evolve for you too?
Yes, that is so interesting, and thank you for mentioning those things on voluntourism. Maybe a topic for another podcast, perhaps. But yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts about that too. But in terms of vegan travel, and maybe another topic that we could talk about on a different podcast was, long story short, I became an international educator working in an international school, which is a really great way to travel for any teachers that are out there listening. But I had been traveling to several different countries, obviously, as an international school teacher. And of course, that gives you some incredible opportunities to explore different regions around the world. But I had actually become besties, really good friends with Colleen Patrick Gaudreau, the person that had inspired me to become vegan in the first place, which is quite crazy. We had become really good friends, like her and her husband, and Seb and I had done some really wonderful, fun trips together. Now, obviously, Seb and I have a background in travel, just our own personal travel and professional travel as tour leaders. And Seb also has a background in logistics. He also has done a lot of work in TV production, which I'm sure you can imagine involves a lot of moving parts in terms of making everything work well. And we suggested to Colleen on, over lots of glasses of wine, over a long period of time, what about seeing if your fans and your followers would like to come on a trip with you, and we'll organize it to Thailand. And with a lot of thanks to Colleen, she actually agreed to give that a go because, like Colleen had a huge impact on me. She's had a huge impact on many, many people. And, vegans love to be around other vegans. Going on a vegan trip has a lot of real great benefits, which perhaps we can talk about later. And she told her fans about the trip, and we actually did a trip to Thailand, which was a huge success. People were saying that it was life-changing, meeting new people was just so wonderful. It was just so easy to have everything done for them. After the success of that, we ran a trip to Vietnam, and due to popular request, we also ran a Christmas trip to Paris and Alsace and 2 trips to Rwanda, which was last summer. We did 2 trips back to back, which was very interesting. And it was after these kind of trips came to be a success that I said, Seb and I got talking. It's like, well, why don't we see if we can do this full time? We seem to be good at actually running the trips, and with the support of Colleen, who was happy to continue working with us, for a few trips a year. Maybe we can reach out to other vegan influencers and perhaps, try to sell our own trips as well, so that we could make this sustainable. So that's really kind of what we're working on at the moment. So that's really how we came to set up Well Vegan Travel.
Very interesting story. Tell us about the demographic of tourists that come on these trips with you. What kind of age ranges, what kind of backgrounds are they coming from?
Sure. Well, our trips are more sort of luxury trip. There are some really great vegan travel tour companies that are already out there. And I find it quite interesting that Intrepid Travel, the company that I worked for in the early 2000s, they actually have vegan tours as well, although of course they're not a vegan-owned company. And so our trips are more sort of luxurious, and we were we consciously chose to do that. Now, without going into a lot of details about it, like Seb in the past 5 or 6 years or so, he's become quite a proficient travel hacker. Do you know what a travel hacker is, Mark? Perhaps you do.
I do, but explain for the sake of the audience, yeah.
Right. So a travel hacker is somebody who, is very, I guess, clever and well-studied in terms of collecting points and being able to do some incredible travel experiences without paying a lot of money. So think about collecting credit cards and using those points for hotels and all of these kinds of things. So Seb did a really great job at this. This is kind of his skill set. This is where his skill set just flourishes. And we had some amazing travel experiences at quite a luxurious level. But when we got to these, beautiful hotels, we found it was frustrating that even though we weren't actually paying, if we had have been paying a lot of money for these, we would have really been shortchanged in terms of what was available on the breakfast buffet, what was available in the hotels, and these kinds of things. So that sort of frustrated us a little bit, and we just felt that people at the higher end weren't getting good value for money when they would go on a non-vegan tour or stay in a luxury tour or stay in luxury hotels. And of course we'd had a bit of a taste for these kinds of experiences, and we really enjoyed them too. And so we decided to sort of make our trips sort of more luxurious and staying at much nicer accommodation than maybe other groups would stay at. And so we decided that we would sort of focus at the higher end. And of course that means having to work very closely with the hotels to make sure that our travelers get the same or as good as what a non-vegan traveler would get staying there. So our travelers are generally a little bit older, certainly not backpackers or flash packers. Sometimes we get young people in their early 30s who love traveling with us. Sometimes it can be people, over 70, which of course is wonderful too. We don't even have all of our travelers being vegan. Sometimes there'll be a friend or a spouse of a vegan traveler, and it was very sweet. We got some feedback from one of our travelers, and I kind of had this idea in my mind that the non-vegan spouses were being pulled into this trip kicking and screaming by the vegan, but it was so sweet. Actually, for this particular traveler, that wasn't the case. It was actually the non-vegan spouse's idea for them both to come on the trip, because they were like, we do all of these tours and you never get the chance to eat. Why don't we go on a trip where you can really enjoy the food for a change? And and so that was very sweet. And spouses, take note, that is a very nice thing to do. And he actually said that he didn't feel like he missed out on anything by coming on the trip as a non-vegan. So it's so generally usually it's veganism is a real a reason why they would come to travel with like-minded people, to know that the food's going to be vegan, but also that it will be a safe space as well. And of course, you're not going to be visiting any areas where there's explicit animal exploitation.
I like the way you explain it on your website. You call it vegan curious people, and I think that's really another good level to introduce people based on what you've just explained about how you can get associated with veganism without diving in straight away, right? You can actually go and have a nice travel experience, be around people who are vegans. And again, I go back to the whole education thing. If you're educating yourself about, impact on lifestyle, impact on health, all these other things that you don't probably research enough of before you change your life in any way, you can get all that kind of experience from one of your travel experiences.
Yep, I think so.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, you've talked about your recent trips over the last couple of years and some of the things that you have in the planning. We have a very unique situation going on in the world as we speak today with the coronavirus. How do you see that potentially impacting your travel experiences with your guests?
That's a really great question. A couple of people have asked me about that recently. I certainly haven't seen any impact yet. Maybe it's because of the places where we're traveling to. Maybe it's because we don't have departures every week yet, but we certainly haven't had anyone reach out to us and want to cancel their trip because of concerns about something like that. So I to be honest, I don't know, and nothing's really sort of forced me to feel like I need to deal with that yet. I mean, certainly we all need to be very conscious as we're traveling, and maybe that I do have a responsibility to talk to our travelers, as part of our pre-departure information, and explain, ways that they can protect themselves more, and share what WHO is advising our travelers to do. But to be honest, as yet, I haven't seen a huge amount that I need to change personally. I'm happy to be corrected in this area. But certainly, in the past with SARS, when in the early 2000s, when I was working for Intrepid, that was one of the reasons why Intrepid decided to move and broaden their departures to places like Europe, because they wanted to diversify the destinations in which they go, so that, if something bad does happen in one region, it's not going to have such an impact into their overall revenue.
I guess we're in a situation where we've seen in the last 48 hours around the world, there's been a lot of new cases in different countries. I saw last night there was a train that was stopped between Austria and Italy because there was a couple of people on the train that had convicted the
Really?
virus and all the rest of it. So
Wow.
I guess this is a really important thing in talking to people like yourself who run a travel-based organisation that are taking responsibility and accountability of other human beings
Yes.
around the world. Do you think there might be a need to put an asterisk next to some of your packages that are coming up and saying, look, we've got to readdress this on a day-to-day basis and just see where things are coming closer to the date? Because you and I don't know how
Yes.
this is going to go, right? This
Oh,
is something
absolutely.
and I've been astounded lately on my show because I talk to so many people that have done so many amazing travel experiences, and the one common thing that I always find is people do not have a medical plan when they travel. People don't
Right. Oh,
spend
yes.
spend a lot of time researching all the things about, okay, where am I going to? Where are the nearest hospitals? What if something goes
Yes.
wrong? Can I get airlifted out of there? Do I have my blood type on me somewhere that somebody can
Yes.
access it quickly? Have I got it in several languages? And I actually did a show on this recently, and I've had so much feedback from people saying, thank goodness someone talked about this, because I've been traveling
Right.
for years and I don't make a medical plan. And if something went terribly wrong, like it has happened to myself, and this is why I actually did it, you can be left high and dry. Like there can be a real, not only a financial impact, but a huge emotional impact as well.
Yes, yeah, I agree with you. I'm still so shocked when I realize that when I speak to people, and of course you have to have travel insurance to come on one of our trips, including medical evacuation, but I'll meet travelers who don't have travel insurance, and I'm just horrified. I can share maybe an interesting situation of how we dealt with this last year. So when we were going to Rwanda, it was just when the Ebola crisis was blowing up in neighboring countries to Rwanda, and of course that was huge news. And yes, of course, our travelers had a lot of questions about that. I mean, we don't have a lot of departures, so we can just be updating people in our, we have a Facebook group for each trip that we have, and of course we're communicating by email. So of course, we're looking at travel advisories. We're talking to our partners on the ground in the country, and all of these things. So, it's interesting. We haven't had, we didn't have anybody cancel on us with Rwanda, and based on the information we gave them. But, it was so funny when we had a trip in France at Christmas time, just when all of the strikes were happening, and we actually did have people drop out of the trip because of the strikes, which was so interesting to me because, it wasn't like they were protests. It was just that, certain things weren't functioning, rather than, any threat of danger. And we had people pull out because of that. So, it was interesting.
That's, somebody who's obviously travelled a lot like yourself and myself, you see all these kinds of human behaviour coming into the travel experience. It always amazes me, isn't it? How different people react to different situations,
Yes,
and that's not a judgment call. That's just how people are, and that's fine.
Yep.
That's the way it is. Now let's get back to World Vegan Travel in terms of where do you and Seb see this organisation in 5 years from now? What's the kind of vision around where you're going to be with it?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So we would love to be having maybe about 10 trips a year, adding 1 or 2 different destinations each year. Something that we've noticed is that our travelers tend to, we've got quite a few repeat travelers. So, just repeating this a few trips every year will just not work because our repeat travelers will run out of trips. So we would love to be going to a number of different countries. It has to be countries that, we think our travelers want to go to, and places that Seb and I are really excited about, because of course it's a huge investment of time to put a vegan trip together, especially to the level of detail and that our standards require of us. So we would love to have 10, maybe 12 trips a year to different destinations traveling. And at the moment, we do have our kitty cats. So our cats do require us to have a bit of a home base, but they are getting a little bit older now. we would love to, when our kitty cats are no longer with us, we would love to be running this business, obviously having a base somewhere, but also at the same time RVing and traveling around the world and, having lots of things, and then just, going to the country to run our trips and then going back on the road, that kind of thing. That would be a wonderful state to be in. Of course, right now is great. We're grateful for everything that we're doing right now, but that would be a lovely goal for us.
So the whole, I guess, the digital nomad experience in terms of being able to package up a business that you manage online, go and base yourself somewhere in the world, and then being able to travel freely from that base to be able to continue to experience different things in your life.
Yes.
The perfect lifestyle. Tell me, traveling as a vegan on one of your trips, does it give you a different experience of going to a particular destination? Do you see the world differently traveling as a vegan?
That is a really great question. Thank you so much for asking that. I would say yes. Of course, travel is such a wonderful experience. Most people find it really fantastic. But I think there are certain things that you see through a different lens when you become vegan. And I'm not trying to say that, it's only vegans that can feel empathy and vegans that can feel compassion. Of course, I would never want to say that. But I have a little bit of an example to share. I learned to scuba dive before I was vegan. And of course, it was so much fun and I loved it. And it was, of course, really seeing the fish was so cool. And then it was quite a few years before I did it again. And I did it again as a vegan. And, the experience was just so much richer and deeper for me. And I think that was because I was just filled with complete awe and wonder at just what was going on here. And of course, maybe non-vegans have that emotion as well. I certainly didn't have that emotion as a non-vegan, but I looked at all of these fish and I saw them as individuals, and I noticed, fish with young fish and older fish, and I noticed all of the interactions, and I really could see just how in so many ways they were just like us. They were scared when we got too close and they swam away, or they seemed to play. You see dolphins and turtles and all of these other creatures, and you just can't help but think, wow, these animals are just like us. And certainly before I was vegan, I was concerned, and I had a lot of empathy for humans and the situations that people were in, and especially groups of people that suffer and all of these kinds of things. But I do think that becoming vegan set me out on a path to really thinking a little bit more about issues regarding race, issues regarding privilege, and environmental issues and these kinds of things. Because when you become vegan, when I became vegan, I should say, I'm sure other people have had this feeling. Your whole world gets transformed. Your worldview changes, and you look at the whole world in a different way, and you realize that something that I was doing before I became vegan, it was normal. That was what society was telling me to do. This is the adverts that I was seeing on TV to eat meat. This is our culture. This is our tradition. This is just normal, natural, nice, and necessary. These were the messages that I had received for the first 33 years of my life. And then when you realize that, wow, that isn't quite right, that is quite a jarring feeling. And you kind of, I'm summarizing here, you kind of feel like you've been lied to a little bit. And when you come through that sort of transformation, you kind of realize, wow, well, if I was wrong about that, is it possible that I'm wrong about a lot of other things that I have been told or I have been led to believe, or in fact that I actually do believe. And it's because of that I think it has really helped me be a lot more open and less sensitive when it comes to finding out about new ideas regarding, capitalism, race, environmentalism, and, if I could be wrong, in inverted commas, about this, then I can be wrong about other things as well. So, I think I've become more empathetic, I've become more compassionate, I've become able to see the shades of grey in things, and I think it's, generally speaking, it's made me a better person than I was before.
That's a really good sharing, and I thank you for your openness and transparency on this, because what I'm hearing throughout the show with you today is not just this dedicated focus to veganism, but also the conscious living philosophy that you now have as part of your life. And I think that's as equally as important for all of us to look at and ask more questions about our consumption habits, our way of living, our impact on the planet. These all are things that in this current generation are very important aspects of who we are as a species, right? And I'm so glad that it's becoming more topical. I'm not into the activism side of it, because I think, I don't go around every day saying that you should enjoy your steak every now and again, because I am a meat eater still, but I'm very happy to educate myself on veganism and other aspects, but I do live a very conscious life when it comes to sustainable living. I wanted to ask you about that, because from a travel perspective, there's a lot of focus these days on sustainable travel, and there's conferences now around the world that are dedicated to sustainable travel and talking more about how we are polluting the planet. Are you somebody that thinks that we should all stop flying and take other means of transport to get around?
That is a great question, and I'm pleased that you touched on this, because that is my current dilemma. As someone that has a travel company, this is something, and I would love, maybe it's outside the possibilities of this podcast to talk about this in depth, but this is something I have been thinking a lot about, and like 100 times a day.
That's a lot.
It really is. This is just my personality to just sort of really, because it's this dichotomy, isn't it? Of we know that travel is life-changing, and an interesting fact that I learned. I actually recorded a podcast for my podcast with somebody from a climate offsetting group, because I was just feeling so compromised. I think that's the word, with this issue, and I just really wanted to learn a little bit more about this whole issue and regarding carbon offsetting, because I was hearing a lot of different pros and cons about this whole thing, and I won't go into all of that now. But he actually told me that that after the Second World War, when they were having lots of talks and reflecting over the what happened in the Holocaust, of course, one of the reasons why, apparently, I haven't checked this, I'm just going by what he said. One of the reasons why it was decided to not tax airline fuel, he said, was because they wanted to make freedom of movement cheaper, so that we would never have a repeat of what happened in World War II again. They wanted people to be getting out into the world and to be experiencing things. Now, of course, the world is a different place now. It's actually quite easy through documentaries, films, videos, YouTube, to really know what's going on in the world. So I thought that was really interesting. We know that travel is a really great thing, and I do think that we need to be cutting down on the amounts of flights that we have, because I believe it's something like 4 or 5% of the climate gases are from aviation. But when you factor, which seems like a small amount, but it's only a very small minority of the population, much, much, much less than 4% of the world, that is actually doing this. So So, if we're traveling by plane, that we really need to be thinking about this. And I do think it's the consumer's responsibility to be doing, to try to limit their flights, but also industry needs to do more and government needs to do more. The airlines certainly need to do much more in terms of regulations, in terms of how they run their airlines and technologies into these kinds of things. So I think we need to attack this problem from multiple different ways, and maybe we'll get to a point where we'll need to ration flights and these kinds of things, and of course that will, and consumers may decide that they will want to fly less, and maybe companies like ours will not be successful, and I guess that's okay. And something that we are really thinking about as a company is like, how can we be doing better in this area, and we're in talks at the moment to try to figure out how to do that. That's a long answer, I'm sorry. I've got a lot to say apparently.
No, that's good. It's a conversation that has to be had, and I think in terms of, if I was to play devil's advocate for a second, which I will for the sake of a lot of the listeners out there that are probably thinking the same thing, is here you are taking a group, maybe 20, 25 people all the way across the world to Rwanda on aircraft, and I guess you're practicing a lifestyle where you want to be conscious more about living, yet here you are putting all those people on a plane. Now, in my past life, I used to be in the corporate world, and I worked very closely with Airbus and Boeing, and I was very interested to see the evolution that's happening in the aircraft technologies, and you touched on this now. But I think one of the things that we need to do as a human race is we need to understand not only the cost, but also the timeline associated with changing technologies. And there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes today in the aviation industry around electric propulsion systems for aircraft, and all those types of things are going to clean up the airline industry very quickly. But as you can well understand, there's a lot of regulation around safety and cost and all those things that need to be ironed out, and they just simply don't happen within a 12-month period or a 2-year period. Even these things can take decades to actually come to fruition. So I guess we have to be mindful as consumers, though, that we want change to happen quickly, and we live in this world today where someone posts something online and we all want to jump on board and either support it or tell everybody how much we hate it. The reality is, when you say to an organisation, we want you to change your entire air fleet to electric propulsion to be a cleaner airline, then that's a great vision to have, but the reality is that it may take us a generation or a decade at least to get to that newfound principle. So I think we need to have, and again, it's the same discussion that we're having around being a vegan, is because some people don't want to change overnight. Some people have to go through the epiphany trail that you did when you changed and listened to a podcast, or they may listen to you talking on my podcast today and go, you know what, I want to become a vegan. And that is fantastic. But I think it's a little bit like the conversation around spirituality and someone becoming more spiritual in their life. There's an evolution to that process. And maybe one day, once somebody wakes up out of their sleep and says, you know what, I want to become more spiritual, or I want to become a vegan, and I'm going to start researching about that. So I think it's a really interesting time that we live in, because as you've just said, we've got all this information that's available to us. We have a lot of the answers in our head, but taking that and putting it into practice. That's why I asked you, where do you see world vegan travel in 5 years from now? I think it's almost impossible to predict where your company's going to be, right? Because of all these things we've talked about today are going to have an impact on your organisation in some way or another, as is your own lifestyle. And when you chase your dream to be based in a location somewhere and running your tour companies around your tour company around the world, it's going to be fascinating to watch. So I'm going to stay tuned for the next 5 years to see where world vegan travel is going. Now, Brighde, before we've rushed through our time, and I'm definitely going to invite you back because we need to have more conversation, but I want to talk about your podcast, because you are also a podcaster. So you obviously don't sleep very much because you're running a travel company. You're doing all these amazing things with your partner, Seb, and now you're a podcaster. So how did you get into podcasting?
Well, obviously, throughout my travels and research, I've come to realize that that a lot of vegans are a little bit cautious about traveling because they're worried that they won't find anything to eat and all of those kinds of things, and that there are going to be a lot of challenges. So, I wanted to sort of address that. And, I'm not saying that I necessarily expect or want, think vegans should be jumping on a plane and traveling to the other end of the world. Like, I think a lot of us need a reminder to just even get out just a little bit further than our bubble, our work home bubble a little bit. So, there's I want to encourage vegans to get out and explore the world, even if it's just close by, because we know that spending time in nature is good for our souls and can help us just function so much better in everyday life. And a break from the routine can be really, really good, especially for vegans, because we often feel a big burden on our shoulders. And when you come to realize that animals are being killed and eaten in such huge numbers, and you see it everywhere, and everyone eating animals, it can feel you can get a little bit down from time to time. And I think getting away from that can be really nice. And also, I've discovered that there are so many amazing vegan travel opportunities, whether it's tour operators or tour operators like walking tours in Paris, or these kind of outfits that the world needs to know about, that exists. And vegan hotels that are out there now, there are so many and more opening. Every month I find out about a new one, and it's just so exciting. And also just to find out about the travel that vegans are doing. So, for example, a friend of mine, she was interviewed on my podcast, and we've just released it yesterday, and she has a very popular vegan travel blog called Nomadic Vegan, and she actually did the Siberian Express, the Siberian train ride, as a vegan, and there were no vegan food options on the train to speak of. Yet, of course, she was fine. She didn't starve. And not only is it fun to know that, but of course, hearing those travel stories are just so fun and interesting as well. So, it's a way for vegans to hear travel stories without sort of hearing about, the amazing non-vegan experience that the storyteller is sharing. So, that's kind of the premise behind it.
What have you found so well, not so difficult, but what have you found as one of the challenges of being a podcaster?
That's really good question. I guess I'm still challenged with the editing. I'm not very happy with the quality, if I'm completely honest, in terms of the sound and those kinds of things. I'm all sorted for season 1 in terms of I've recorded them. I don't think I'm going to improve the quality for the rest of this season, but for season 2, I'm going to try to step it up a little bit and just get more of the technical know-how about it.
Well, keep at it, because I've listened to a couple of your podcasts, and they're really, really good. They're interesting, and you've got a great way of being a host on your own show. So keep it going, keep committed to it, and it'll all come right. Trust me, you get it over time, and it becomes another habit that's easily formed.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Thank you for your feedback, and thank you for listening.
Now, before I let you go today, I've got some quick-fire, rapid questions that I want you to give me some 1 or 2 word answers. Can you do that for me?
Yes, I might need some thinking time, but yes.
Okay, so the first one is window or aisle, and why?
Window. I don't need to get out very often, and I like the view.
Okay, good. What's your favourite snack food when you travel? Seaweed snacks. I like to have some of those. Seaweed snacks. Okay, good. What? Give me 2 shortcuts you've learnt over the years that make travel more enjoyable for you.
Happy Cow, the app.
Never heard of it. Tell me about it. What's Happy Cow?
Great. It's most vegans know about it. I'm sure it's basically a database of all of the vegan and vegetarian and veg-friendly restaurants around the world. So you can just turn it on wherever you are, and you can find a place close by to you that has vegan food. So yeah, and it's always fun to plan your trip around delicious restaurants too.
Okay.
And the second one, my zero waste travel kit. I like to travel with that to try to help minimize the amount of waste that I produce.
Okay, brilliant. What are the two first things you pack in your suitcase when you go off on a trip?
I'm a really disorganized packer. I have a list, but everything just gets thrown in.
So there's nothing that has to be in that suitcase first, like a phone charger or something?
No. I have a list that I keep in my bullet journal, which is a top tip that I just refer to just check off. But yeah, there's nothing really. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So let's end the show today with more of a philosophical question. How do you think travel has changed you and your view of the world over the years that you've been traveling so far?
If I had not traveled and lived overseas, I'm sure I would not be as open-minded and vulnerable and willing to be wrong had I stayed in the village where I grew up. So I would say that has made me a better person.
Beautiful answer, and a good one to end the show on. Brighde Reed, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Global Travel Channel podcast show today. I'm going to say merci beaucoup, and thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great time, and I'd love to have you back sometime in the future.
Merci. Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
What another wonderful conversation. I love chatting to Brighde there about conscious living, becoming more conscious, whether you're a vegan or not, but understanding our impact that we're all having on the planet. And in particular, if we choose to travel, what impact that could actually have. So, wonderful episode. Enjoyed it. Brighde, thanks for coming on my show. And I'm going to make sure I put all the details and links to your website and podcast show in the show notes so everybody can find out more about you and what you're doing in your wonderful world of vegan world travel. So that's it, everybody, for this episode. Don't forget, if you want to check out other episodes of the Global Travel Channel podcast show, head on over to our website, www.globaltravelchannel.com. It's easy as that. You can download our podcast from places like Apple iTunes under the podcast section, from platforms like Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, all the usual places where you get your podcasts from. You'll find the Global Travel Channel. Don't forget, we have a Patreon page, so you can not only find the posts there, you can find also posts about other things that are going on in the Global Travel Channel, behind the scenes stuff. That's where you get it, at the Global Travel Channel podcast show Patreon page. If you like our content, make sure you tell a friend or a family member or a work colleague about the Global Travel Channel podcast. We're trying to continue to grow our audience across the world. Okay, well, that's it for this particular episode. My name is Mark Philpott. Until we meet again, I want to wish you all a very happy and safe bon voyage.